So it's Friday at 7 p.m. and instead of having sex, we're going to talk about sex. That's what we're doing here. Okay, so Justin, I'll turn to you in a second, but there's a lot of conversation in the world about a sex recession. Can you raise your hands in the audience if you've heard about the sex recession or believe it to be true? Raise your hands. Wow, very few people here. If you are personally affected by the sex recession, keep your hand up.
Yeah.
No, okay. But Justin, tell us, is there actually a sex recession happening globally?
Yeah, thanks. Thrilled to be with everyone. I know we're the only thing between you and cocktails for the evening, so we'll, so maybe that'll make the cocktails more exciting the more we talk about sex. So what we mean when we say a sex recession is that what we're seeing in a bunch of different data sets in the United States, the UK, Australia, Japan, Germany, actually all over the developed world, we're seeing decreases in sexual frequency. And studies that have looked over time, we're seeing that the number of times people are having sex over the last year seems to be going down. So the big question of that is, what does it mean? And the other question is it a problem? So you'll hear this term used more and more. People are talking about the sex recession, and people are talking a lot about it alongside these fertility declines. Is that part of what's going on? We're seeing declines in fertility. People are engaging in mating behavior less.
Okay, so what's going on, and does it matter?
What's so interesting about these discussions is that there's all these different theories of what could be going on, and some seem almost implausible. So one argument, for instance, is it hormones in the diet? Is the increases in estrogen disruptors in our shampoos and our diets, is that impacting our desire for sexual activity? Is it the density with which we live? We're living in such dense styles different from our ancestors.
But you've also found that certain like in your annual Singles in America study, you found that certain demographics were actually having more sex, like people in their 40s. And people who are having sex more, and people who aren't having sex are just not having sex at all, correct?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And that's where the nuance is. So we see in the overall in the population, frequency of sex is down, but not for everyone. And there's an important other question I'm really interested in. What about the quality of your sex? So if we're focused on quantity, how often you're having sex, that number's going down. Not necessarily quality. We also did a study recently on older people 60 and older. And as we age, our sexual frequency tends to decline for both men and women. But for older people, particularly for women, particularly for postmenopausal women, frequency goes down, but quality stays the same, and then it starts to uptick. So older women are having some of the best sex of their lives, even though they're doing it less. So you should date older, but yeah.
That's the rule. But you've just written this book, The Intimate Animal. It's being broadcast to you on the stage and here. It's an excellent book. And
thank you.
Despite the sex recession, you talk about us. I mean, it's really easy to be at a conference like DLD where we're talking about technology all day, and we begin to believe that we're more like this thing than we are like ourselves. You know, so your book is really interesting because it brings us back to this embodied experience of being a social animal. And I want you to talk about that. What is the intimacy we seek? What biologically within us, as an evolutionary biologist, makes us seek that?
Yeah, and it's actually been really fun, especially as we're talking a lot about AI and technology this weekend, that we really think about, well, what is this human animal? What's inside us? So we know, what do we know? Where do we start? We know that we're a social animal, and that has implications for everything. We know that our ancestors lived socially, ate socially, practiced hygiene socially, died socially, that all aspects of our life are embedded in social dynamics. But for what I'm interested in, and one of the arguments I make, is that a couple, the idea of a romantic and sexual partner, long-term romantic partnership, is at the core of that. Anthropologists sometimes say that it takes a couple to raise a child, it takes a family to raise that couple, and it takes a village to raise that family. This idea that we're nested in layers of social interactions. But at the core, that idea that we are looking for someone. I mean, Plato famously wrote about that we're searching for our other half our whole lives. Well, it turns out when we look at human biology, when we look at evolutionary process, for over 4 million years, our species have been looking for their other half, looking for a co-pilot to experience life with. Almost all of our sexual interactions, particularly reproductive sex, occurs in the context of long-term bonds. So this idea that we have sexual interactions that are technologically mediated, or the idea that we can have casual sex. I started my career writing about casual sex because I was interested in how people were finding intimacy in uncommitted encounters. That we're still looking for this container of connection within which our sexual lives are happening.
You speak in the book about, and I think a lot of anthropologists look at this, intimacy is not just in the context of that sexual relationship or the romantic pair bond relationship. And you distinguish between these two, and then you have a third, so you have pair bonds, sexual relationships, and close friends, or close relationships. How often do people find all three in one person?
Oh gosh, so that's the challenge, right? And I think one of the things that we saw in our work on hookups and casual sex and friends with benefits was that people were sometimes navigating. They would have a casual sex encounter, and we found 51% of men and women in an American sample, no gender difference, had hoped that it would turn into a romantic relationship. In a national sample, we found that a third of people who engage in hookups, that they eventually turn into romantic relationships. In a separate study on friends with benefits, we found the biggest challenge is one person acquiring romantic feelings for the other. Right? We talk about it almost like a sickness, like I'm falling in love. What do I do now? So what we find is that we can think about this triangle of our social relationships: romantic, sexual, and friendship, or deep connection. And ideally, what we look for in our partners, romantic partners, is all three. For sexual partners, less so. But when we look for romantic partners to weather life with, we're trying to get all three of those tips of the triangle. And one challenge can be, and I'm not a moralist about this, so it's not a moral position, but one challenge if you have sexual relationships and you want it to convert to a romantic relationship like we see in the data, is the friendship piece. And it can be difficult to have a sexual relationship that becomes friends. It's much easier to have a friendship that you then have a sexual component to. It's why a lot of people ultimately date their friends. It's why we found in COVID, 1 in 4 people had sex with a friend that they lived with. Because that friendship part can expand out because you have a sense of trust that's there.
It's easier to build on top of that, layer that. Okay. And we are not the only animals out there that are pair bonding, but we are there's something unique about humans, right?
Yeah.
Talk about that in the context of the whole animal kingdom.
Yeah,
what is wild about humans?
Yeah, so much. We're getting wild, right? So when we look at this potential for pair bonding, only 3% of mammals engage in these long-term pair bonds. 15% of primates, so more of our kind of more closely related relatives. Now, birds, 90% of species engage in pair bonds, but often only for a mating system. There's only a handful that we know that do it beyond that. So what that tells us is that we're unique in that we form, so much of our mating occurs in these long-term bonds. But we're also unique in the fact that they can last a lifetime, that they can be enduring for so long.
Can they?
Well, the fact that we have the biological architecture for it. I think the part that we sometimes can take for granted is that our brains are capable of falling in love, that we can maintain that over time. We can. We did a study on over 50,000 people. We asked the question, what keeps passion alive? What keeps that feeling of long-term couples going? And you can cultivate it. So should I say what we found? I'll say what we found.
Yeah.
So what we found
Don't be a tease, Justin.
that sample. Yeah, don't you want to know? Gotta go. Bye. So 50,000 people who had been in a relationship long-term, and then we did separate samples of gay men and lesbian women. And what we found was that there was a handful of things: communication, engaging in sexual activity. The thing no one says when they look at long-term relationship issues is the biggest predictor of divorce in all the big meta-analysis is sexual problems. So if
not money, it's sex.
Not money, not family, not politics, not the weather.
Money.
It's
the weather.
Sex, right? That's sex.
I stopped liking him because it was sunny.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's interesting in a moment, not to be political, but when we think of when there's this real desire to think about the family, particularly in the West, this idea of like thinking of families and how do we help traditional families. Help couples have more sex. That's how you protect American families and traditional families, because we know it's so important for couples.
In the United States, the Heritage Foundation just wrote a report about this.
Yeah, right. And how do we think about cultivating that? Okay, so communication, sexual activity, and the other particular certain types of sexual activity. So it was kissing and oral sex were particularly predictive of passion in long-term couples. And then there were a handful of things about intentionality. So lighting candles, reading magazines together, like magazines with like tips. And I remember my colleagues and I thought, like, all these tips and magazines are all nonsense. Why would they actually help people's relationships? Unless we're totally wrong. We've been wrong all these years. I don't think it was about the actual tips that you got.
No, it's about the desire to improve for your partner,
Exactly.
to build something together
This
that's
intentionality.
better.
Same with a
Yes.
candle. It's not the particular smell of the candle. It's that I'm trying to set the mood. I'm trying to focus on passion and romance in my relationship, and that fuels it.
So unless it's a citron candle, those can be huge aphrodisiacs. So what I felt then, humans are very capable of believing in this long-term pair bond. But what I found very sad, deflating in your book is that you talk about how human relationships are getting, quote, wider and shallower.
Mm-hmm.
So speak about that. And is that happening around the world, or is that unique to the Western world where we have kind of a greater reliance on nuclear family, which is itself eroding?
Mm-hmm. So we're starting to see in more examples and more places of the world this is happening. The great opportunity of social networks was that you expand out your social connections. You have more ties in your social network. The challenge is that in the best case, you want to balance a lot of ties and a few really strong ties. So you want the best of both worlds. The person you can call and rely on when you need something, but then also that broad network when you're just curious about something in your world. What we're seeing is more people have these diverse networks. You can log onto your platform. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals. Turns out the human brain really only has the capacity to hold close about 150 people. And sort of the social brain hypothesis that evolutionists will talk about. So we see that there's less emphasis on that really close community and more on expanding. So rather than trying to balance it, a few really tight, a lot more thin, we've invested so much in the ever-expanding thin network, and less so on the few that are really tight.
And this, of course, is probably contributing to the sense of loneliness we have. We feel we have many relationships, but no deep grounding relationship.
And interesting, in a report that came out not terribly long ago, there's some suggestion, we talk about this loneliness crisis. This is not just in the United States, not just in the UK, not just in Europe. We're seeing it globally. And in fact, more countries are investing in loneliness ministers, or some ways to think about, is the loneliness really about couples and relationships? Is it all about all of our social behavior in our interaction? Interestingly, in some of the data, loneliness itself hasn't increased. So the rates seem somewhat stable. What has increased is the impact on our health and well-being. In one analysis, loneliness, psychological loneliness, is as bad for your health as smoking a whole pack of cigarettes every day. So we can think about how the impact of that loneliness, but I think you're right. One of the things we see is that if you don't have those close connections, that starts to wear on your sense of connection. As one example, all the literature on social support. We know social support is important for psychological and physical health, hugely important. It's not actually that you know that I can call up Nayeema and say, hey, will you do stitches for me? Will you take me to the hospital? Will you feed me tonight? No. It's more that I know that if I need to call someone, I will. So it's the belief that you have people in your network that will show up. So I think the big question for us is, we have these ever-expanding networks. Do we really believe that any of them will show up? And I think most of us know no, they won't.
Well, to answer your question, I will feed you tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
I think Yossi will, but yes.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's amazing is that when I've heard you speak about what happens to our brains when we fall in love, and also when we fall out of love, or when we're rejected, rather.
Yeah.
So I want you to give a little bit of a taste to people, and this should resonate with you, but what happens to a brain in love? And then let's talk about what happens to a brain that's rejected.
Yeah, so when we start feeling romance or romantic love for someone, different theorists have used different terms. Sometimes we use limerence as a word. What we see is that it's not, it's social, but there's also a neurobiological response, which makes sense, because when we look at species that pair bond and don't pair bond, it turns out that there's different structures in the brain, oxytocin, dopamine, how they function, so what they're doing in the brain. So
You know this through fMRI.
we know this from animal studies. So a lot of work has been looked at this little species of vole. It's a small rodent. There's one species that's monogamous and one that's non-monogamous. So they've done studies looking at their brain differences in the oxytocin systems, prairie vole and the montane vole. And then also brain scans, fMRI brain scans, so functional magnetic resonance imaging. You put people in a brain scanner and you look at oxygenated blood flow. Where is the brain calling on more blood to fuel so it can do its thing? So what we see is that when people are in love, if you put them in a brain scanner and scan their brain, this is work by my late colleague Helen Fisher, you see a little pea-sized part of the brain, the ventral tegmental area, that pulls in more dopamine. Dopamine, the sort of reward circuits, pleasure circuits. Dopamine is actually most important for rewards that we think are happening in the future. So this idea that being around your beloved, it's not just that I want it right now. I want it now and tomorrow and the day after and the week after, that there's this sense of continued rewards. You could see where I'm getting at. It sounds like an addictive pattern, right? So we know that dopamine's involved in romantic love. You see a rise of dopamine, you see a suppression of serotonin, which is why some people experience clammy hands, they have butterflies in their stomach, they get excited, you have that euphoria feeling. In another context, that's an anxiety attack, right? And if you're sitting down for an exam and you feel that, you go, what's going on with my body? It's awfully similar in terms of what's happening. Now, the other part of that, what happens when love is lost, we see, if you put, and my colleagues did this, they put people in a brain scanner who had just gone through romantic rejection. And when you look at their brains, now, we just talked about dopamine, it being almost addictive. When you look at the brains of people going through with rejection, they still have all the attachment systems. Mother Nature doesn't shut off your connection that quickly. They have the attachment systems, but then they have parts of their brain that look remarkably like someone going through cocaine withdrawal. So they're in physical pain. If you know someone who's going through a breakup and they say it hurts, it's not just a mental state. They are in physical pain. The way the body processes the loss. Mother Nature, we evolved these abilities to form these intense bonds, these pair bonds, right? These deep human connections. When they get severed, nature takes its pound of flesh. We feel the pain of that severing.
And is the first pain always the worst? Or do we become better at withdrawing from cocaine over the course of our lives?
Yeah, I have a pet theory. It's funny you say that. I have this pet theory that what we're seeing with younger generations in particular, and who knows what the effect is, but because we have a wider gap, so people today have younger ages at puberty and they have older ages at first birth and marriage and sex. So we're seeing this unprecedented gap of periods. So younger people are having more relationships than past generations. They're moving in and out. Some of them more casual, but they're moving in and out of more relationships. I think they're going through more breakups. And I'm convinced, what does that mean? What does that mean for the world that young people are experiencing that pain more? I don't know. I don't have an answer. It's just something
You don't have an answer.
that I'm curious about. So we don't know. What we do know is that first sexual experiences and first breakups can shape trajectories of future relationships. So if you have a particular bad one, that could make you kind of gun-shy about future connections. But that doesn't stop people from falling in love. And it shouldn't stop them from falling in love, right? There's sort of looking for more and more connection.
I want to do a bit of a lightning round because I want to get people out within 10 minutes to have dinner. But let's do a lightning round. So each of these things, I want to know if it's mythology or a master of our destiny.
Okay.
So first of all, monogamy. Mythology or master?
No. Okay, monogamy. So the big thing, I have to talk fast. I'm a professor. I can't not use a lot of words.
Try hard.
Okay. So with monogamy, the issue is it is part of our DNA and our biology. However, here's the big catch. As a biologist, we talk about two levers of monogamy. There's social monogamy, pair bonding, mutual territory defense, mutual nest building, mutual raising of offspring. That's the pair bond. That is biology. Our species has done that for 4 to 4.4 million years. Between Ardipithecus and Lucy, we saw evidence of pair bonds. That is a different lever from sexual fidelity. So as a biologist, we never use the term monogamy. We talk about social monogamy, the pair bond, the relationship structure, and sexual monogamy, which is fidelity. And in fact, there was different evolutionary pressures on each of those levers. The pressure for both men and women to form intense bonds, but then also the lever for variety. And when we understand that, I actually think we can navigate the tensions in our love and sex lives a lot better.
Through polyamory or?
For some people, we found about 1 in 5 Americans in a sample have at some point had an open relationship. Lower number, 21% to be exact, but a lower number at any given time. For most people, there can also be, that comes with other challenges, jealousy, managing multiple partners. I mean, romantic love is psychologically we describe it as focused attention, and that can be hard when you're trying to focus on multiple people.
What about this idea of alphas? I think in a conference like this, you have a lot of people who are extremely successful at what they do. A lot of people identify as alpha. People are looking for their alpha. Tell us about alpha in the animal kingdom and the human animal kingdom.
I love that you bring this up. I think especially one of the things I tried to do in the book is we all use these examples from nature, right? Whether we're talking about human nature or the animal world and what's happening to testosterone, what's happening to, I want to be an alpha wolf. And the testosterone one's a great one. People often say, well, my testosterone's higher in the morning. My colleague who did all of those studies years ago, 50% of men have testosterone highest in the morning, 25% stay the same, and 25% increase throughout the day. So this idea that we all walk around with this idea that T is highest in the morning for 1 out of 2 people, but there's the other 2. So alphas, people talk about wanting to be the alpha. The big secret about an alpha wolf? There isn't an alpha wolf. There is an alpha couple. Wolf packs are led by a pair, a partnered pair, and most of the pack is their family unit. It's often their offspring, grand offspring. So this idea that an alpha, you're kind of going through life in charge on your own. No, you're going in charge as a partnership, as a couple.
So then the last one I'm going to ask you about, independence. Is that, we have been packaged and sold and marketed independence. We've been told to self-actualize before we enter into that romantic pair bond for our future. Is that a myth?
It's the worst myth. And I think that we see so much of this. Okay, now I'm going to get really punchy. And so we think about, this idea that we need to work on ourselves. Go work on yourself before you can date and be in a relationship. What we see more and more in data sets, including in our multinational data, is an expectation that you work on yourself. You go to therapy, you really figure out who you are before you date. And more we expect our partners to. We expect, well, you should also go work on yourself. You're not ready for a relationship. You're not ready for love. You're not ready for kids. You go work on yourself. The problem with that is that we think that we're doing this as individuals, that we should just I'm going to just go back to my corner and work on myself for a couple of years and I'll be ready for connection. That is, and we're seeing it increasingly in data that young people, particularly young people, are saying, I'm not ready. I have to work, and then I have to work through my traumas. I have to work through my early life experiences. I have to work through. Do we think our ancestors had to work on themselves before they had a partnership? Do you think a gorilla has to work on itself before it engages in social behavior? This idea, it's so limiting. And I think it really is tied to this idea of an overfocus on efficiency and optimization. A relationship with the idea that you have the number one thing people look for in a relationship is someone you can trust and confide in, more than physical attraction. That's true of every big multinational study on attraction. We look for a partner we can trust and confide in. This idea that the partnership is your someone you can navigate the world with, you can respond to uncertainty. The relationship itself can be the container within which we self-actualize, within which we find ourselves, we make our mistakes, we learn what we want. This idea that we're doing it often secret, and then we're going to come back fully formed, ready for a relationship, and as if everything in that relationship is going to just go so smoothly because we use some imaginary idea of what a person is and what a relational dynamic is. I think it's so challenging and so problematic. We should find ourselves in relationships, make the mistakes, experience the expansion of self with the co-pilot you can trust to make a mistake, and they will pick you back up.
With your fellow alpha wolf. I like in the book you talk about what's good for me, what's good for you, what's good for us as a kind of treatise for a relationship that I think is a very healthy one. Okay, last lightning round question, and then we'll do a wrapper. You speak about, as an evolutionary biologist, how the human brain has grown threefold in size over the course of human evolution, so tripled in size. Now we live in an AI world. Is it shrinking?
Oh, that's a good question. I think, in one way, I think it's a question we're all thinking of, right? And there are all these early hints that what's going on with social media, is it impacting the density of connections in the brain? Particular things about the hippocampus and the striatum, like our ability to process information. But if I can, I want to reframe the question.
Okay.
And I think in some ways the issue is our brain increasing? Is it shrinking? Is it evolving? That's a question. But I think the more pressing one that that you're getting at, and that so many of us are trying to wrangle, is do we have an evolutionary mismatch between that brain that evolves so much, this enormous prefrontal cortex, our ability to make decision makings, our ability to be ethical, our ability to create AI in the first place? Do we have a mismatch between that and this current technological moment? And I think that's the same issue actually at the core of people's struggles with relationships.
And what's the mismatch?
Mismatch is one of it is how we process data and how we process information. We have more data and information than we're really good at making decisions about. So it's the same issue at the core of online dating. At the core of online and app dating, which is now the most common way singles meet partners in every country we've studied, every industrialized country we've studied, the issue is there's so much data that people are not making connections. So you might meet someone on an app and you go out on a first date with them, but then where you really start to struggle is the brain is saying, they're not perfect. Look at the way they held their fork. There's 3,000 other people on your app before you get to your next meal. You can find someone who holds the fork right? So we get obsessed with these minutia because we have a sense that there's so many options. That is totally unique for our species. And it somewhat does a trick on the way that sometimes people talk about the paradox of choice. There's other kind of psychological cognitive mechanisms at play. But a big issue is how do we kind of sift through that noise and make decisions? The human brain is not really prepared for that. Same with mating. We evolved in a context that you knew someone's actual social network. You often knew their family networks. You could hear them. You could see their body language. You could smell them. You could maybe taste them. You invoke the bodily senses. We're divorced from that more and more, and I think we have to be cautious to remember that we have highly evolved adaptive systems that rely on those biological senses.
So I want to close out recognizing a little bit the country we're in, because Justin, you're the executive director of the Kinsey Institute at the University of Indiana that was established in the 1940s. And it's the premier kind of research center for sex and sex studies and archives. But about 30 years before the Kinsey Institute came to be, there was an Institute for Sexualwissenschaft. Did I say that right? In Germany, and this existed since the 1910s, I think 1919. Talk a little bit about the history and if there's any connection between that German institution, which of course was squashed and burned literally to the ground, right, by Nazis, and today, what you're doing.
It's actually an interesting time to reflect on it, because as we think about what's happening globally today, with sort of this political tenor and with questions about fascism and questions about government control of information, well, we know historically that sex and sexuality is often something that gets controlled very early on.
Yeah, autocrats, really, authoritarian regimes really like to clamp down on gender. They want to have sexual and gender repression. What's up? Are autocrats not getting laid? What's happening?
We don't have great data on that, but although increasingly there's one person who's been making arguments that when you look across some particular people in history, a number of them have pretty interesting sexual dysfunctions.
Yeah, like repressed.
Yeah. So I'll leave that one out there. But so we do know that there is often this idea of a traditional family, right? This idea of returning to the traditional family, which I always find interesting, because what do people really think is this traditional family, right? We have this sense of that's also divorced from human evolution. Similar to the alpha comment you made earlier, Nayeema, we talk about this idea like, oh, men are the providers and men are the decision makers and family units. That's not actually human evolution. It's a lovely story to tell yourself, but it's not human evolution. In human evolution, there's the argument of man the hunter, go out and get the big meat, and then there's the woman the gatherer. We know that women bring more calories into a household than men. The steady beat of gathering brought more food into the home for our ancestors than the meat hunt, which had protein. It had other kinds of advantages for human evolution. But we have this fantasy, we have this fantasy that it's sort of like, I'm going to go out, I'm the provider, I'm going to hunt. And it's like, well, you don't really need to be here. We could live without you. So I think, again, that's these cautions about how we rely on these notions.
That's why you asked me to feed you tonight.
Yeah, because I'm not prepared to hunt. So we have that right piece of it.
Yeah.
Okay, but I'm straying from the from what you asked me. But my point being that we have these ideas of traditional family units, and what we see is that autocrats often lean into them. Historically, we lean into these notions of what a man and a woman should do, what a family unit, because then you can control it, right? If someone has these queer sexualities, how do you fit it into a box to control it? How do you control reproduction? How do you control the beat of new generations? It's why almost every religion has some practice about influencing family formation and promoting, right? As Genesis, be fruitful and multiply, right? It's sort of pretty early on, they tell you what the objective is. And so that's one piece. But you're right, and part of that too, to get back earlier, is so Dr. Kinsey, Alfred Kinsey, is talked about as the American father of sexology as a field. He was heavily influenced what was happening to Hirschfeld. So we know in 1933, Nazi youth came in and burned down most of the Sexuality Institute. Hirschfeld was known for coining the term transsexual. So he was a physician and was really interested in how we used science and medical information as social justice, how to make people's lives more informed and healthy and equitable. And so Kinsey was aware of that. He saw what was happening in Europe in the 1930s, particularly around sexuality, but he hadn't really worked on sex yet. He was an entomologist who studied insects. In fact, the history of the Institute was he was asked to teach...
Do insects have sex?
I
guess they must.
Yeah, of course. Actually, some really interesting cases. There's really interesting cases of...
We have an insect sexologist in the crowd.
There's some examples of what are called like traumatic sexual events where males will sometimes bore into the side of a female, or other examples where females will mate with males and then they cut their heads off like praying mantises. So the natural world is what we call red in tooth and claw when we think about these examples. So Kinsey was studying insects. He was studying gall wasps. And he was asked to teach the marriage course at Indiana University. So in the 1930s and 40s, in the US, we were seeing a rise of these sexual hygiene marriage courses at major universities. And the university thought, well, this is safe. Ask that biologist who studies insects to do the part on mating behavior, right, on sexual reproduction. But what happened, I think, represents, and still should represent, the very best of what a university is about. And it was that the students had so many questions that the faculty couldn't answer. The answers weren't in the textbooks, they weren't in the library. Dr. Kinsey said, we have to go start asking, we have an obligation. We are faculty, we are researchers. We have an obligation to find answers. So they started conducting these sex histories in Bloomington, and then eventually throughout North America. And so that ultimately turned into the founding of the Institute for Sex Research in 1947, which is now called the Kinsey Institute. And so it's very much informed by what was happening globally and the need to collect actual data. In the absence of that data, you asked about myths before. In the absence of data, we have so much mythology about sex and relationships and reproduction. And that mythology develops in the absence of any real good, accurate information about our sexual lives.
All right. Well, we want to end on a more positive note than authoritarian and insect sex.
Yeah.
So... people are going to be dancing tonight. I believe that dancing is one of the classical kind of mating, animal mating rituals, correct?
Yeah.
So do you have any dancing tips for the audience tonight as they're going out and maybe
out
on the prowl? What tips do you could also get up and demonstrate if you want. Tell us a little bit about how you could make yourself attractive on a dance floor.
Yeah. Oh, I love this. It's I wasn't expecting this one. I had no idea was coming.
We can demonstrate.
Yeah. So one of the things about dancing that is great. There have been some studies looking at dancing and mate choice and partner choice. It's about synchrony. I
asked him about dancing, and he said studies. Yes.
Yeah, so I can't help myself. And it's about synchrony. So we often think, I have a picture, for instance, in my office of these weedy sea dragons. And what I love about weedy sea dragons, it's a pipefish, like a seahorse. And what I love about them is that they engage in this, it's called a mirror dance. And for hours and hours and hours off the oceans, in the waters off of Australia, they will mirror each other's move. It's what we call behavioral synchrony. And synchrony is quite important. It's when a flock of birds fly. It's when we're engaging in this mating dance. And we all know when synchrony is out of whack. If you've ever been on a Zoom call or a phone call and you just can't, you're always a word off of each other, it's so frustrating. It's because we've fallen out of that behavioral synchrony. Dancing is actually very important for initiating processes. It's the same for sex. If you've ever had sex with someone and you're really out of sync, it's like you're listening to different music. You just want to go home or go somewhere. You want to go to a cocktail lounge and find someone else, right? That idea that part of sex, part of a connection is is that synchrony of dancing. So I think the tip on dancing is, yes, dancing is great, get the body moving, and especially if you're drawn close to someone, you feel them, you hear them, you smell them. Pheromones, maybe not what's going on, but we do know that smell is important. But the big tip, try to be in synchrony with each other. Try to listen to the same music in your body. That's where you start to build that erotic energy, on a dance floor and throughout a relationship.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Justin Garcia. The book is called The Intimate Animal, The Science of Sex, Fidelity, Why We Live and Die for Love. My show's called Smart Girl, Dumb Question. I hope you all dance like seahorses tonight.
Yeah.
And then have sex like insects. Goodbye.
Thanks.